Hi there, Tony Mello, Strategic Insurance. We are doing a video today going over the National Flood Insurance Program. We're accessing it here through Wright Flood. Um, when it comes to flood insurance, it's something we obviously have to be prepared for our clients, as many clients, especially in Florida, own homes that are in flood zones um, requiring flood insurance. So just a quick overview of some basic things that we'll touch on in the video. If you kind of want to jot down some notes of terms that will start flying around. First and foremost, NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. I will typically refer to it as NFIP, National Program, FEMA Flood, some variation of that, referring to the national product. One thing to keep in mind is that if it's the NFIP product, regardless of whether it says Wright Flood or it says Progressive or State Farm or Allstate or whoever, fill in the blank, anybody can write flood insurance and service it, because at the end of the day, it's still all paid for and backed by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. All that ends up happening is FEMA says we can't service all these, so here, you want to write them, go ahead. So you have Wright Flood, you have ASI Progressive, you have Tower Hill does it, Frontline does it, United does it, Prepared does it, a lot of our homeowners companies. For us, the main companies we go to are Wright Flood and here and there ASI Progressive. There are, some companies will give you like a 5% savings on the homeowners if you write the flood through them. Long story short, it becomes far too messy to deal with. So we really just offer Wright Flood for the most part. Again, ASI Progressive is the outlier because we used them a lot previously. So you'll see where we do use them. I have written policies with them before. Even after Wright Flood, they're kind of the random occurrences. Primarily, we use Wright Flood. It is in robo form. It's going to be the best bet for you. All they do is flood. They really know what they're talking about. You can have this chat feature here. You need to talk to them. You can call them. Really, really great support. Again, that's why we use Wright Flood. Now, in National Flood Insurance, you have, when it comes to rating, there are three primary flood zones. Flood Zone X, Flood Zone A, Flood Zone V. You may see an elevation certificate that has any version of that. You could say A1 to A30. You could say AR, AO, any variation. But basically, X, A, or V are the three zones. X zone, real simple. We'll talk about it. It is the low risk flood zone. So everybody is in a flood zone. Every building is listed in a flood zone somewhere. What happens is it an X zone, an A zone, or a V zone? With the latter two being the high risk or very high risk zones that are will have a mortgage lender require flood insurance. So to simplify, the low risk or the preferred risk program, also referred to as the PRP flood, it's very simple. The way that they rate it is it's just a set rate the program determines, and this is the pricing for it. The sheet is available on Dropbox and regularly updated, because if there is a change in rate, then obviously if there's a change in rate from the program, the rates could change. 2 years ago, it was $456 for this level of coverage. Obviously, now we've seen it go up to $516. But again, it's at the end of the day, you're looking at a $500 policy that somebody can purchase if they're in the low risk zone, just to make sure that they've got coverage. Because ask anybody in our office what happened during Hurricane Irma, and all of a sudden, people who never wanted flood insurance thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So if you have a risk that is not in is not in a high zone, or it is in the X zone, I always like to send this off to the client and let them know, hey, based upon their building coverage, if they've got a $200,000 building, hey, you're looking at about $487 a year to have flood. Now, what you'll see, this is a pre-packaged combo platter, if you will. You can't change anything. You're going to get this set deductible. You're going to get this set amount of contents. So let's say the client who has a $200,000 house has 100 grand on contents. Maybe they want the 100 grand of contents. Well, they're gonna have to bump up to the next level of the program. So what I usually do is just let every client know, hey, flood insurance is available, costs you about $500 a year. And obviously, if it's a little less, it's a little less. But that's one thing you can always let the clients know, because ultimately, if something does change and they decide they want it, they don't know what's available to them, or better said, they don't know what they don't know. So that covers the preferred risk program, the PRP. Make sure you drop that in with every client, let them know it's available there, and it's a good little cross-sell opportunity. The nice thing about flood insurance as well, not that it has any bearing on how we write it, but they do pay 20% on commission. So little fun fact for you there. Probably one of the higher lines of business that you'll see, outside of life insurance. So that covers that. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to throw some initial glossary terms around. NFIP we've covered, PRP we've covered. So now you're going to hear pre-firm and post-firm. In short, pre-firm is before FEMA went and made the flood maps. So there was no flood insurance program. There was no specification as to how to build buildings so they don't flood. It's before the maps. This rolled out in the 70s, sometimes 71, sometimes 74, and it could go into as late as early 80s. Now, you need to know if a building is pre-firm or post-firm to know what you need to rate it. So post-firm is after the maps were, if the building was constructed after the maps were created. So let's say we have a flood map that was originally 1971. That's when they first rolled out the first map. And we have a house that's built in 1974. That is post-firm, post-mapping. What that means is we need an elevation certificate, which looks something like this. Bear with me while I grab this. Aha, okay. So, elevation certificate. This is what an elevation certificate looks like. The reason you need to know whether you need it is pre-firm homes, you do not require an elevation certificate to get a rate from the program. It's good because in most cases, the home would result in a less favorable rate than the pre-firm subsidized rate. If the client has a certificate, you want to get it because it may help them out later down the road, but chances are today it may not. So you're going to have a ton of information on here that could result from the garage venting information, the crawl space information, the garage information. You're also going to see here, it has the flood zone listed on it for you. It's going to show you the firm, the most recent firm flood insurance rate map. And then it's going to show you the base flood elevation. This is the elevation that FEMA says, based upon our mapping, we need to be elevated above 10 feet to avoid flood damage. So, in the simplest form I can explain, you have this information here, that's your base flood, and then you're going to have the actual elevation data of the building. The bottom floor, highest floor, garage, machinery, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Simply put, if this number, the bottom floor, is higher than this number, you're going to get a really good rate. If this number is below the base flood elevation, you're going to get a less favorable rate. That's a very oversimplified explanation to looking at this. There's a lot more that goes into it, but you can use that determination typically when looking at if you have a pre-firm home and you have the certificate, what makes the most sense to use? Should we use the pre-firm subsidized rate, or should we use the actual rating off of the EC or elevation certificate? Write that one down. So that's what you want to look at. Now, in the case of the home we're going to do here, we actually have the elevation certificate The home was built in 1997, so it is absolutely post-firm. And so we now need to use this information to rate the building. I'm going to put this off to the side for now. A couple of other housekeeping items I'll say are, so we've covered pre and post firm. We've covered the preferred risk program for the X zone homes. And then we also have to cover the A and the V zone flood zones. When you have a federally backed mortgage, you have to have flood insurance. That's where we have the high risk flood zones, where people may say, oh, I am in a flood zone or I am not in a flood zone. X zone is still a flood zone, it's just low risk. So, for conversational purposes, A and V are the flood zones. Flood zone A means you're going to have rising water. Flood zone V means rising water and surging and pushing, so a lot higher risk of, well, this picture really tells a story. This is an A zone. This could be the V zone. It's pushing. So I always explain X is low risk, A is high risk, V is very high risk. You can remember V, very. You might also say VE, very expensive, but not always the case. So when we need to find out if we're going to rate a building, it's very simple. We're going to go to Wright Flood here. We'll start a new quote. This is the homepage of Wright Flood. Flood is flood, the regular primary flood. Then we have excess flood, which we'll talk about later. Excess flood, well, let's talk about that now. Primary national program policy, you're going to get up to $250,000 on the building. You're going to get up to $100,000 on contents. You can pick the amount you want, so long as it's not the preferred product. If you have a home that's over $250,000, so let's say we have a building that has a replacement cost of $500,000, $500,000, make it simple. Okay, the bank is only going to require the first $250,000 because that's all the national program offers. The bank can't require you to have more insurance than what is regularly available. So that's where an excess policy can come into play. So you've got client Mr. Smith buying a home. It's a $500,000 home. He wants his flood insurance. He says to you, well, I only have $250,000 here, but you gave me $500,000 on the homeowners. Well, Mr. Smith, we can cover that additional gap on the flood insurance with an excess flood policy. Would you like a proposal for that? No problem. What that policy does is it picks up from $250,000 on the main policy and covers the additional replacement cost. So in this case, if we had a $500,000 building, we need another $250,000. And so that excess policy would pick up from $250,000 on the primary policy and give you an additional $250,000 or a total of $500,000. That's the purpose of the excess flood policy. We'll again talk about that later. I have a whole separate video for that. So we want to rate a flood policy here. We need to find out how to do it. Now, if you hit quote, it's going to load up the page here. It's going to ask you, is it a business? It's not, assuming it's not. Put the client's information. I'll go ahead and use mine. So we would put the address. Now, it's going to ask you if the mailing address is the same as the property address. Something to keep in mind with national flood insurance, and this is another important thing to talk to your client about. National flood insurance will charge one rate if it's a primary residence and charge a separate rate if it's a secondary residence or a rental. Basically, something that you, the owner, do not occupy as your primary residence in any way that looks. So, if you have a primary occupied home, you're going to get a fairly competitive rate. If it's a secondary home or a rental, you're going to get a much higher rate. There's another difference here, which is that the non-primary residences, the buildings do not get replacement cost. They get depreciated value. That's something we can address at a later point, but the problem with that is sometimes a bank will require a replacement cost. I've seen it happen. So that can pose a little bit of a challenge if you find yourself into a situation like that. reach out to one of the team members, and we can obviously walk you through that and see how the best way to proceed on that is. But in this case, my mailing address is the same. It's going to ask you, do you want to run zone determination? Yes, we do. Here's why we want to do that. Maybe you're working and you need to find out if it is in a flood zone or not. You want to do this for every client anyway, just to make sure you're offering them the correct coverage. Occasionally, if there's a discrepancy, you want to get a zone determination, you can do that. It's going to ask you if there are multiple structures on the property. Typically answer that no. If you do have that, again, maybe there's a primary house with a detached guest house, pool house, something. You're going to answer that question differently, but reach out to one of the team. It gets a little more complex in terms of how we have to do it. And then it's going to ask you, how do you want this determination delivered? Email. You'll have your email already here. You can go ahead and hit next. Apparently, I missed a digit on the phone number. Hit next. It's going to run it. You will then get an email that you can go ahead and drop into the file. And you definitely want to do this because this helps tremendously down the road when we have to do remarkets on a file. And that email will look something like this. It's a pretty basic email, but you're going to get, it shows you the client, and it's going to give you a certificate here that you can open. And you'll see here the address, the flood zone here, the most recent map, and then if there's any other issues, and it gives you a little picture of the map showing you if there's any flood zone. So that's important. You want to take this email, drop it into the file. That way you can go ahead and do that. That way we have it for records for down the road. Now, I'm going to bypass this and kind of jump a little bit because I do have one that I wanted to go through. And looking at the time on this video, I may put that in a separate video. So I think that's what I'm going to end up doing. We'll run a separate video on flood of start to finish for quoting. But if you have any other questions, again, it's a very brief overview of flood insurance. It can get a little clumsy and complicated just depending on the building, the client, how they're using it. We have a lot of other flood insurance markets available as well. That's already addressed in a separate video. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. What I may actually do here, upon thinking about it, is let's run through the quote. Why not? Have a little bit of time left. So if you hit next, it's going to ask you what the waiting period is. Flood insurance does have a 30-day waiting period, unless it's for a loan closing with a mortgage. So client who is buying a brand new home, cash, would not be able to bypass the waiting period because there's no lender involved. So 30-day waiting period on national flood insurance policies. Private market can vary. Talk to us about the private market. The effective date, we can go ahead and put, let's just say, down the road. It's past the 30-day waiting period. Is it required under mandatory purchase? In this case, it's not. It is you're either going to have the choice for a single condo unit, the condo building itself, or other. In most cases, it's going to be other unless it is a single condo unit. The original construction date. Then you'll have, has it been substantially improved? No. If the answer to that question is yes, or if you're ever unsure about that, again, reach out to the team. What that basically means is that, let's say I had a house built in 1963 and I put on an addition that was more than 50% of the building's value in 1999. That means that I have to rate it from 1999 spec. Don't worry about it for now. If it comes up, talk to the team. We'll help you through it. Construction date is based on the date of construction. The policy type, because we have the option to use the preferred program, we can. So we would hit preferred, and it's going to ask, is the insured a tenant? I'm not the tenant because I own the building, so the answer to that is no. Is it a rental property? No, because I live here. Am I a nonprofit entity? No. Original purchase date, let's just do that for purpose. You need to put the purchase date in there. And then so this question here, it asks if I or a spouse have ever had a policy with the national program. In most cases, that's no, especially if it's a new purchase. Again, talk to us if that answer to that question is yes. Is it required for disaster assistance? Typically no. So it's going to ask the building purpose. Now, what you're going to see here is that these questions very closely mimic how you would issue a pre-firm policy. So we have a 1963 house. Let's pretend I was in a flood zone and I have, I'm not using my elevation certificate. I can rate this as a pre-firm policy, so I get the pre-firm subsidized rate, and I want to issue the policy. So whether preferred or pre-firm, that's complicated, pre-firm mapping or a preferred risk policy, the issuance is essentially the same. It's a residential building. It's a single family. We're not a small business. It's for the main house. Building description. We're not under construction. Yes, we have walls and a roof. This question, building partially or entirely over water. Not over water. Now you may say, well, what if I have a house that has a dock? That's fine. It's still not over water. They're literally, they're referring to if you had a house that was built on posts in the middle of the water. Google a picture of Bora Bora. You'll see what I'm talking about. If it's entirely or partially over water, ineligible with the program. So basically, it has to be not over water. Include coverage for additions or extensions. Usually none. A little more complicated. If you feel that there are additions or extensions, such as a shed or a fence or anything like that, ask me about it or ask one of the team. We can explain what that means. Just for purposes, you're going to have none. Now they're going to ask you, okay, what percentage of the year do you live in the building? This is where it's important. This is how you determine primary residency. So let's say I own this house and I have a secondary house in fill in the blank state. So Florida is my primary residence. I would either be between, well, I should be between 51% and 79% or 80 or more. These two will result in a primary residence rate. You have to sign a form saying, hey, it's my primary residence. Let's say I'm a snowbird from, again, fill in the blank state, and I have a second house here in Florida. And it is not my primary residence. I live there less than 50% of the year. I come down over the summer for a couple of months and I go back up. That's going to give you 50%. This could also apply in terms of a rental home. So let's say this house, instead of me living here, I rent it out. Now I live here 50% or less. I don't live here. That's going to result in the higher price rating as well as the building being paid on actual cash value instead of replacement cost. So the reason I emphasize this here, if you know it's somebody's secondary house, you might just think to hit this, but even if you hit the middle, then you need to double check because it would still result in primary residency. But I live here 80% or more, so that's fine. It's not on leased federal property. Coverage is for the entire building. Building is not state-owned. Square footage, if you do need to get a rate for an excess flood policy, you could put the square footage in here. You would need to. Garage information, on a pre-firm or a preferred risk policy, it doesn't make a difference. So you can put no. Because if you do put yes, it's going to ask you some additional questions here about the venting on the preferred or pre-firm policies. It doesn't matter. You can just answer no. Basement does not have a basement, but if it did or it had an enclosure, same thing. You would have to put the additional information in for it. Number of floors. This can vary the rate a little bit. So I have one floor. It's going to ask me for my replacement cost. This is where you want to put this in. You want to make sure the number is correct. This way, you've completed as much information in here as possible. So if you need to obtain an excess flood quote, you can. It's going to ask where the contents are stored. It's going to typically be lowest floor. And then if this is a contents only policy. So for purposes, let's say I was a tenant and I wanted to get a policy. If I rented the house, I want to cover my stuff. I would then change the question up here to being a tenant, which would be yes. And it would ask me, do I have an insurable interest in the building? Typically, I don't. But that's not the case here. But if I was a tenant, I would hit yes up here, and then I would change this to contents only, at which point I would then have the correct rate for a contents only flood policy. Another key factor here, regardless of primary residency or not, contents is always paid at actual cash value on flood. So on homeowners, you have the choice of replacement cost or actual cash value for your contents. Here, go get a brand new TV versus we depreciate your TV and pay you what it's worth. Flood is always actual cash value with the national program. Does not matter upon primary residency. If that's something a client is looking for, that's where the private market comes into play. We have a whole video on private market. So feel free to watch that, or again, shoot an email, ask a question. We're here to help. So getting back to this, it's not contents only. We hit next. You'll then see here we have the option for, we have that same sheet that I kind of pulled up earlier, and it's going to show you can have up to this much, these different levels of building coverage with the included contents coverage. You have a client who says, I don't want contents coverage, I only want the building on a on a preferred risk policy. There's nothing we can do about it. Ultimately, if we were to rate the building properly, the client would pay a lot more for just the building coverage than $516. So we want to give them the best possible price, him or her. So I want my $250-$100. I hit next. The deductibles are non-adjustable as well. They're the set deductibles. Again, pre-packaged, bundled policy from the program. It's in a way a take it or leave it situation. Now, when you get to this side, you're going to see that we have a lot of other options. So, National Flood Insurance. That's obviously what we're really concerned about here. That's the program we just rated. You'll see we have Zurich as an option as well. That's a private market company. You're going to see some issues with these two companies where it says Hiscox and the Chubb PFA. If it would return a rate, it will tell you. If it's not returning a rate, it won't. It makes sense. Furthermore, you'll see the option for the excess policy. This is important as well because it's going to tell you for that client who asks, I have a $500,000 building, but only $250 of flood. I need more coverage. That's not enough. Well, here it is. Here's your excess policy, which you can go ahead and you can actually, if you right click and hit open a new tab, it'll actually bridge you over into the excess policy, into the excess quoting. You put the square footage, answer some questions, ultimately it returns a rate for you. You can now click here, go back to the NFIP, the primary quote, and finish this up. It's going to load the info. We hit next. System would work, that would be great. Gotta love technology when it works, folks. Okay, so here we are again. We can hit close. Now, at this point here, you can hover or click the Documents tab, hit Flood Quote. You'll then get your flood quote you can send to your client. This is also the point where you would begin to issue the policy. So you could hit Add Lender if you needed to add a lender. There's some pre-filled ones here. You can go ahead and do that. You would then hit next. On a preferred risk policy, a PRP policy, low risk zone, it's up to the client if they want to add the lender to the policy or not. Typically, if it's not required by the lender, we don't add the lender. It just makes a little bit of a headache down the road because it confuses them. But it is, in fact, an option if they so chose. Obviously, on the A or V zone properties, you have to add the lender. So they get listed on it just the same way that the lender gets listed on the homeowner's policy. Here we are. To go to the issuing side, you click Doug's name. It's going to ask who pays the renewal. If we're not adding a mortgagee, obviously the insured pays the bill. Then it's going to ask you, how are you paying this today? You can either do it with EFT or you can do it with a credit card. There is an option for check in the mail, but when we issue a flood policy, we need payment at the time of issuance with the National Flood Insurance Program. You have to call the client and get a payment before you can issue this policy. If you don't, it won't let you issue the policy. So, when you're on the phone with the client, you're talking over it, and you firm up the decision, you're going to say, hey, we want to go ahead and get payment, get that policy issued for you. It's part of the flood insurance procedure. So you can put in a credit card. They take all 4 of the main cards, no fees. So if somebody's got a rewards card they want to use, have fun, tack it in there. If they want to use EFT, they can do that too with routing and account information. You would then hit next. It'll ask you, are you sure you want to submit? You'll submit it. You'll then get a copy of the application to save and a copy of the payment receipt, and you want to send that to the client as well. And then obviously proceed with your checklist and get it over to processing. So this way, the application go out for signature by our processing team, and that we can get everything issued into the company. So that's a quick overview of the preferred risk pre-firm flood rating. So we do have a video with the private market overview. We do also have 2 more videos coming. One is issuing a policy with an elevation certificate, and finally an excess policy for that same building to make sure we get the client their full $750,000 of building value for their flood insurance. So if you have any questions, reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to me or any of the folks here on the team. We are more than happy to help you. Flood insurance can get confusing at times. Gotta love the government. So if you have any questions, absolutely ask us. The last thing we want is to make a mistake for a client. That's obviously a no-no. But more importantly, we want to make sure you're properly educating the clients as well. So thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the remaining videos.